I've been a placer miner in Alaska for 19 seasons. I've seen things out on those remote claims that I can't explain. But what happened to Jack on his claim still gives me chills. Every morning he'd wake up and find his sluice box cleaned, tailings restacked, and gold in the riffles he hadn't run. Someone was working his claim at night, 90 air miles from a road, and they never took a single flake. Jack had been working that claim for 14 seasons. He knew every rock on that creek. So when he walked down to his sluice box one morning in June and saw it had been cleaned and restacked, he knew immediately that someone else had been there. But his claim sits 90 air miles from the nearest road, and there was no sign of a plane, no boat, no tracks. Over the next 11 weeks, the same thing happened every night. The work was skilled, better than his own. Jack set up a trail camera to catch whoever was doing it. What it recorded defied explanation. And what he eventually learned about his claim's history made him sell it at a loss and get out for good. Let's go back to the start of that season. In late May of 2019, Jack packed his gear into a de Havilland Beaver float plane and flew out of Fairbanks. He'd been making that same flight every spring for 14 years. 90 air miles northwest, over black spruce and muskeg, no roads, no towns, nothing but raw wilderness until the pilot banked toward a silver ribbon of creek and set the floats down on a gravel bar. Jack's claim was a half-mile stretch of that creek, a deposit he'd staked himself back in 2006 when gold was pushing $700 an ounce. Now it was over $1,500, and that ground was his life. He had a wall tent, a small wood stove, a sluice box he'd built by hand, and a single satellite phone he used once a week to check in with his wife back in Wasilla. The isolation was total. In an average season, he'd see the pilot twice, once when he flew in, once when he flew out. That was it. Placer mining alone is hard to describe to someone who's never done it. You're shoveling gravel from the creek bed into a sluice box, a long aluminum trough with riffles across the bottom. Water flows through it, carrying the lighter material away while the gold, heavy as it is, drops into the riffles and gets trapped. At the end of the day, you clean out the concentrates, pan them down, and weigh what you've got. It's repetitive, physical, meditative work. Jack liked the rhythm of it. He liked the solitude. He knew that creek like a person knows the rooms of their own house. Every bend, every boulder, every seam of pay gravel. He also knew that nobody else had any reason to be out there. His claim was surrounded by 70 miles of government land that hadn't been actively prospected since the Roosevelt administration, which is why what happened on the morning of June 9th stopped him cold. He'd walked down to his sluice box at first light, coffee thermos in hand, and immediately saw that something was wrong. The tailings pile at the discharge end of the box was squared off. Neat. Deliberate. Nobody shovels tailings into a square unless they're thinking about it. Then he looked at the sluice itself. The riffles were clean, not clogged with black sand and gravel like he'd left them the night before. They'd been washed out, the concentrates removed and apparently panned elsewhere, because in the top 3 riffles there was fine gold he had not run through that box. Pinhead flakes, a little flour gold, maybe a tenth of an ounce total, sitting there like someone had placed it with tweezers. Jack's first thought was that he'd slept wrong, that he'd cleaned it himself the night before and forgot. But he hadn't. He knew he hadn't. He was a careful man. He checked the ground around the sluice. No footprints. No boat drag marks on the bank. No signs of a camp. The only sound was the creek and a raven somewhere up the drainage. He told himself it was a one-time thing. Maybe a bear had messed with the box and coincidentally left it cleaner than he ever could. That didn't make sense, but neither did anything else. The next morning it happened again. Same squared tailings, same clean box, same gift of gold in the riffles, not a lot, maybe $40 or $50 worth at spot price, but the fact that it was there at all was unnerving. Whoever was doing this wasn't taking anything. They were working his claim for free and leaving the gold behind. Jack started setting tests. He placed small stones on the sluice frame in specific patterns. He drew a line in the gravel below the box with a stick. He even tied a piece of fishing line low across the path to the creek, a trip wire that would snap if anyone walked through. Every morning the stones were restacked, the line erased, the fishing line unbroken. It was as if the ground itself had rearranged. By late June, Jack was losing sleep. He'd lie in his tent listening to the creek, waiting for the crunch of gravel or the splash of a stranger's boot, but there was nothing. Only the wind in the birch and the occasional howl of a distant wolf pack. He'd get up at 3 in the morning and stumble down to the sluice box with a headlamp, hoping to catch the intruder in the act. It never mattered. The box was always already clean. The work had been done while he slept, and the quality of the work was, and I'm quoting Jack here, impossible. The tailings weren't just squared off. They were leveled, compacted. The gold recovery in the riffles was better than his own by a margin he could calculate. He tested it one afternoon. He ran a known weight of gold through the sluice himself, then cleaned it. He got 82% recovery. After a night of whatever was happening, the remaining gold in the tailings was less than 5%. The phantom operator was somehow capturing gold that a standard sluice box should have lost. Jack could not do that. He didn't know anyone who could. In July, he flew in a trail camera. The pilot dropped it off on a resupply run, and Jack set it up on a spruce tree 20 feet from the sluice box, angled to capture the full length of the setup. It was a motion-activated model with infrared night vision, good for wildlife surveys. He set it, tested it, and waited. The next morning, he walked down with a knot in his stomach. The sluice was cleaned again, the tailings restacked, the gold deposited in the riffles like clockwork. He pulled the SD card from the camera and brought it back to his tent. He had a small laptop that ran off a solar panel. He slid the card in and opened the video files. The camera had triggered. He had footage. He hit play. The first recording was time-stamped at 2:14 a.m. The infrared sensor had picked up movement. Jack leaned in, heart hammering, waiting to see a face. Instead, he saw nothing. Just the sluice box, the creek, the dark spruce. But the box was different. He rewound. In the 5-second clip, the sluice box was already cleaner than it had been at dusk. The tailings were already squared. The change had happened between frames. He watched the next clip, 3:20 a.m., same thing. The sluice was further along. The riffles had gold in them that hadn't been there before. No figure, no shadow, no animal. Just an object changing state as if time itself had edited someone out. Jack sat in his tent and stared at the screen. He had 11 weeks of footage to go through. And when he finally got through all of it, what he saw broke something in him. But he still didn't have the worst of it. That came when he flew out in October and spoke to an old miner in Bethel who knew the history of that creek, and who told Jack that he was not the first man to work that ground. Not by a long shot. The first man had been a Norwegian named Jakob, and he died on that claim in 1934. The old miner's name was Walter. Jack found him in a dusty supply shop at the edge of Bethel, a town of 6,000 people perched on the Kuskokwim River. Walter had been mining the western Alaska gold field since the 1970s. He'd seen claims change hands 100 times. He'd seen men come back from the bush with their nerves shot and their minds changed. When Jack walked into his store on a cold October afternoon and started asking about the history of his claim, Walter didn't laugh. He didn't tell Jack he'd been alone too long. He just leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, and said 3 words that changed everything. He's still there. Walter knew the claim. He'd prospected that drainage back in the early 80s, 10 miles downstream, and he'd heard the stories from an old Yupik elder who'd trapped that country before the war. The elder told him about a Norwegian miner who had flown into that creek in 1933 with nothing but a pick, a gold pan, and a hand-built sluice box. The man's name was Jakob Lindberg. He had immigrated from Trondheim in 1921, worked the Nome beaches for a few seasons, then headed east into the interior when the easy gold played out. He found that particular stretch of creek in the summer of '33 and staked a placer claim that fall. The gold was good. Not bonanza grade, but steady. Enough to keep a man working through the short Alaska summers and dreaming through the long winters. Jakob built a small cabin on the claim, the ruins of which Jack had never found because they'd been reclaimed by the permafrost and alder decades ago. He worked that ground alone. No partner, no wife, no children. Just the creek, the gold, and the silence. Then in September of 1934, Jakob didn't fly out. The pilot who came to pick him up found him lying face down in the sluice box. His heart had given out, the coroner later said. He'd been dead for at least a day. There was gold in the riffles. He'd been working right up until the moment he died. The claim was never legally transferred. Jakob had no will, no heirs, no next of kin back in Norway. The claim simply reverted to the public domain and sat there, unworked and unvisited, for 80 years. Until Jack staked it in 2006 on ground that looked to him like raw wilderness. Ground he'd chosen himself, based on nothing but the way the creek curved and the color of the gravel and a feeling he couldn't name. When Jack heard that story, he felt the blood drain from his face. He asked Walter for anything else he knew, any details, any records, any names. Walter gave him a file box full of old mining district maps and pointed him toward the Alaska State Archives and the Bureau of Land Management office in Anchorage. Jack flew home. He told his wife very little. That night, he sat at his kitchen table and began pulling every historical record he could find on the original claim. What he discovered made him feel like the ground had opened beneath his feet. Let me pause here and tell you what he found, because this is where the story stops being a strange tale of bush country isolation and starts being something else entirely. Jack obtained a copy of the original placer claim filing from October of 1933. The document was handwritten in fading ink, submitted to the U.S. Land Office in Fairbanks by one Jakob Lindberg, a naturalized citizen of Norwegian birth, age 41. The claim described a 1,500-foot section of creek, bounded by specific survey coordinates, meets and bounds marked from a corner post set at a particular latitude and longitude. Jack pulled out his own claim map, the one he'd filed in 2006, and laid it on the table next to the original. The coordinates matched, not approximately, not within 100 feet. The southeast corner post was described at the exact same GPS reading, down to the 10th of a second. The north line ran along the exact same bearing. The sluice location was noted with a specific distance from the confluence of a small, unnamed tributary, the same tributary Jack had used as his own reference point when he'd first set up his sluice in 2006. The tent site was marked on the original survey sketch with a small circle and the notation camp. Jack's wall tent had been pitched on that exact spot for 14 summers. He had never seen the sketch. He had never known about Jakob. He had walked that ground as a 43-year-old man looking for a place to work and had somehow chosen, with no maps, no records, no inherited knowledge, the exact same footprint that a dead Norwegian had chosen 73 years before him. But there was one more detail in the documents that sent ice through Jack's veins. It wasn't the coordinates. It wasn't the tent site. It was the name. Jack's full name, the one on his birth certificate, is Jakob. He'd gone by Jack his whole life, but he was named after his grandfather, a first-generation Norwegian-American from Minnesota. The name on the original claim filing was Jakob. The name on the current claim filing, the one Jack had submitted in 2006, was, legally speaking, the same name, same spelling, same origin. Jack had never made that connection when he first heard the story in Walter's shop. He'd been so focused on the location that the name hadn't fully registered. Now he was staring at two pieces of paper, separated by 80 years, and they might as well have been written by the same hand. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat up going through the trail camera footage he'd brought back from the claim, the full archive he'd avoided reviewing in detail during the season because it had already unsettled him so deeply. There were 11 weeks of recordings. The camera was motion-activated, set to capture a 10-second video clip whenever it detected movement in the frame. In total, it had triggered 347 times. Jack had watched only a few dozen of those clips on site, enough to see that something impossible was happening. Now, in the safety of his own home, he forced himself to watch all of them. The first pattern was the timing. Every single triggering event occurred between midnight and 4 in the morning. There were no daytime clips except for the ones where Jack himself walked in front of the camera to test it. 168 nights, and on every one of them the camera activated within the same window. The second pattern was the change. Clip by clip, night by night, Jack could watch the sluice box transform. In the first frame of each activation, it would be in one state, dirty, tailings piled, riffles clogged. By the final frame, 10 seconds later, it would be clean. The tailings would be squared. The riffles would contain visible gold. There was no intermediate action captured. No figure stepping into frame. No hands moving across the sluice. No tools, no shadow. The change did not happen within the recording. It happened between one recording and the next, as if whatever was doing the work could sense the camera turning on and off, stepping into the blind gaps with perfect precision. Jack slowed the footage down. He went frame by frame through every clip. In some of them, he noticed something that had escaped him before. A slight distortion in the air near the head of the sluice box. Not a figure exactly. More like a shimmer, the same visual effect you see when heat rises off asphalt in summer. But this was 50-degree Alaska night. There was no heat. It appeared in one clip, vanished in the next, and in every clip where it was present, the sluice box was fully cleaned by the following activation. Jack zoomed in. He adjusted the contrast. He ran the footage through every enhancement tool his laptop had. The shimmer remained a shimmer. It had no shape he could identify. It had no face. But the more he watched it, the more he became convinced that it wasn't random. It was positioned exactly where a man would stand to work the sluice. Right knee slightly bent, as if braced against a rock. Torso angled forward, as if shoveling. The shimmer moved with a rhythm that matched the cadence of manual labor. The camera captured no arms, no legs, no clothing. It captured only the heatless distortion of something that had once been a body, and if Walter's story was true, still insisted on showing up for work every night. Jack toggled to the very last batch of footage, recorded in the final week of September before he flew out. He had expected the same pattern. Instead, he found something else. On the morning of September 27th, 3 days before his scheduled departure, the camera had triggered at 5:03 a.m. outside the normal window. The clip was longer than usual, 15 seconds instead of 10. In it, the sluice box remained untouched. No cleaning, no gold, no shimmer. But the audio which the camera captured through a small built-in microphone picked up something the other clips hadn't. A voice. Quiet, low, just 2 syllables spoken in a tone that was not threatening but somehow worse. It sounded pleased. It sounded like recognition. The voice said Jack's name, not his full name, not Jakob, Jack, the name he used. The name only a living person who had known him for years should have used. And the voice came from the 10-second gap before the shimmer faded out, as if spoken by someone who had been listening to him talk to himself for 11 weeks and had finally decided to say hello. Jack closed the laptop. He walked outside into the cold Alaskan morning and stood in his driveway for a long time. He did not tell his wife what he had heard. He did not call the police. There was nothing to report. There was no crime. There was no intruder. There was only a dead man who had kept his claim running for 80 years and apparently decided that Jack belonged there. He listed the claim for sale the next week. The buyer was a young miner out of Fairbanks who'd heard through the grapevine that Jack was walking away from proven ground at a steep discount. The buyer didn't ask too many questions. He flew out in the spring to work the season, and in July, he called Jack. The call was casual at first, questions about the best way to set up the sluice where the pay gravel was thickest, how to deal with the mosquitoes. Then right before he hung up, the buyer asked one more thing. He asked if Jack had ever noticed anything odd about the sluice in the mornings. Jack said no. He wished him luck. He never called back, but Jack's story is just one of many. I've been working these creeks since 2005, 19 seasons. And I've come to understand something that most miners won't say out loud. The gold isn't just metal in the ground, it's memory. Every ounce of placer gold in Alaska was moved by water, by ice, by time. And sometimes I believe it holds onto the people who chased it. Their habits, their routines, their unfinished business. I know how that sounds. A year ago, I would have laughed at myself for saying it. But after what I've seen, and after what happened to a miner named Earl on a tributary of the 40 Mile River, I don't laugh anymore. Earl was a veteran prospector out of Tok. He'd been mining since the late 70s, a lanky guy with hands like catcher's mitts and a permanent squint from a lifetime under the midnight sun. In the summer of 2020, he was working a small claim on a creek that fed into the 40 Mile, about 40 miles east of Chicken, Alaska. The ground was marginal. He was pulling maybe half an ounce a day if he was lucky, but the solitude suited him. He'd set up his operation near an old tailings pile from the 1890s, a sure sign that someone had been there before him and found enough color to make it worth the effort. Earl liked working near historical ground. He said it felt like having a partner who had already done half the work. The strange activity started in mid-July. It wasn't like Jack's experience with clean sluice boxes and gifted gold. It was the opposite. Earl would leave his sluice set up at night, and in the morning he'd find it partially dismantled. The riffle tray removed, set neatly on the bank. The water hose disconnected from the pump, laid out in a straight line as if someone had coiled it with obsessive care. None of the equipment was damaged. Nothing was stolen. It was as if someone had begun disassembling the operation, then stopped halfway through every single night. Earl started sleeping with a shotgun next to his cot. He'd wake up at random hours and shine his flashlight down toward the creek. He never saw anyone, but twice he heard something, a rhythmic tapping, metal on rock, like a small hammer striking a gold pan. It would echo up from the darkness, then stop the moment he unzipped his tent. One night in early August, Earl decided to set a trap. He strung a line of tin cans across the path to the sluice, filled with pebbles so they'd rattle if anyone stepped through. He stayed awake until 2 a.m., fighting exhaustion, staring at the tent wall with aching eyes. And then just as he was about to drift off, the cans rattled. Not a subtle brush, a violent clatter like someone had kicked them deliberately. Earl grabbed his shotgun and his headlamp and burst out of the tent, yelling into the dark. The cans were scattered across the gravel. The sluice box had been fully dismantled this time, every piece laid out in order. The header box, the riffle tray, the expanded metal, the miner's moss. They were arranged on the bank like an exploded diagram in a mining manual, perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned. And sitting in the center of the arrangement was a single object Earl had never seen before. A gold pan. Old, battered, made of heavy copper, not the modern green plastic. It was engraved with a name on the bottom, H. McPherson, 1902. Earl didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, he hiked up to the old tailings pile and started poking around. He'd always assumed the original miner had simply moved on when the gold played out, but now he wasn't so sure. He dug through the historical records on his satellite phone, slow, expensive, but necessary. What he found made his blood run cold. The claim had originally been filed by a Scottish miner named Hamish McPherson, who arrived in the Fortimile district in 1898. McPherson worked that ground for 4 seasons, pulling modest but steady gold. Then in August of 1902, he vanished. His camp was found intact, tent, tools, food supply, even his journal. But McPherson himself was never seen again. The official report speculated he'd fallen into the creek, hit his head, and been swept downstream. But the journal, which had been archived in the Alaska State Museum, contained a final entry that Earl managed to get a scan of. The entry was dated August 8, 1902. It read, "Someone is dismantling my sluice every night. I will stay awake tonight and confront him." There were no entries after that. Earl was not a superstitious man. He'd spent 40 years in the bush and had never once believed in ghosts. But holding that copper pan with McPherson's name on it, standing on the same ground where a man had vanished 118 years earlier while experiencing the exact same phenomenon, something shifted in his thinking. He didn't sell his claim. He didn't run. He did something that, in retrospect, I think was far braver than anything I would have done. He decided to talk to whatever was out there. He stood at the edge of the creek in the dying light of an August evening and spoke out loud. He said, "Hamish, if you're still here, I'm not here to steal. I'm just trying to make a living. Same as you were, I'll respect this ground. I'll work it right, but you've got to let me be." Then he set the copper pan back on the bank, walked to his tent, and went asleep. That night, for the first time in 3 weeks, nothing was moved. No dismantled equipment. No tapping sounds. Earl woke up at dawn, checked the sluice, and found everything as he'd left it. The copper pan was gone. In its place was a small pile of gold dust, maybe a 1/4 ounce, poured directly onto the gravel in a perfect cone. Earl never had another disturbance on that claim. He worked it for 2 more seasons, and every year on August 8th, he'd leave a small token on the bank, a bit of tobacco, a swig of whiskey, a fresh gold pan. He told me once that he felt more at ease on that claim than anywhere else he'd ever mined. As if he'd made peace with something that had been waiting a century for someone to just acknowledge it. Now I wish every story ended like that. I really do. But Alaska doesn't work that way. For every Hamish McPherson, there's something else out there, something that doesn't want acknowledgement, doesn't want peace, and doesn't leave you gifts. That brings me to the third story, the one I didn't want to tell, the one that happened to me. In 2018, I was working a claim in the western Alaska Range, near the headwaters of a creek that drained into the Kuskokwim. The ground had been recommended to me by a geologist friend who'd flown over it and seen promising gravel formations from the air. No one had ever staked it before, as far as I could tell. It was pristine, untouched mining ground, and I was the first human being to run a sluice on that creek. I flew in with a Bell Jet Ranger in early June, set up camp, and by the end of the first week I was pulling an ounce a day of chunky, water-worn gold, some of the best I'd ever seen. I thought I'd found my retirement claim. The trouble started in the third week with the disappearance of a tool, an ordinary rock hammer, a 22-ounce Estwing with a blue handle I'd owned for 15 years. I left it next to my sample pan one evening. The next morning it was gone. I searched the entire camp. Nothing. I figured I'd dropped it in the creek and moved on. A week later, my gold scale vanished from the tent. I had left it on the folding table next to my journal. Now it was simply not there. I searched the tent inch by inch. I emptied every bag. I even dug through the tailings pile in case I'd somehow scooped it into a bucket. Gone. 2 weeks after that, I woke up to find my shovel missing. Not misplaced, missing. The shovel I'd been using for years, the one with the cracked handle and the worn blade, the one I leaned against the same tree every night. The tree was bare. The shovel was nowhere. I started to feel a pressure in the air, a kind of low-grade dread that I couldn't shake. I'd been alone in the bush plenty of times. I was used to the psychological games isolation plays on you. This was different. This felt like being watched by something that was studying me. I set up my own trail camera just like Jack did. But unlike Jack, I didn't just record the sluice. I aimed it at my camp, tent, fire, ring, equipment, cache. I let it run for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, I checked the footage. I had to sit down when I saw it. The first clip, timestamped 1:47 a.m., showed my tent with me inside, sleeping. The camera triggered again at 2:12 a.m. The tent flap was open. I had not opened it. I have no memory of opening it. The next clip at 2:58 showed something standing at the edge of the trees just beyond the fire ring. It was tall, thin, human-shaped but wrong in the proportions, arms too long, head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it. It didn't move. It just stood there facing the tent for the entire 10-second recording. Then the clip ended. In the next activation at 3:31, it was closer, maybe 10 feet from the tent. The camera's infrared illuminated its eyes as 2 pale white discs, and in its right hand it was holding my shovel, the one with the cracked handle. It had my shovel. I have never felt fear like I felt in that moment. I was looking at something that had been 3 feet from my sleeping body while I lay there unaware, holding a tool it had taken from me days earlier. The final clip was recorded at 4:04 a.m. The figure was gone. But my shovel was standing upright in the middle of my camp, blade driven 2 inches into the permafrost, handle pointing at the sky like a grave marker. And hanging from the handle, swinging gently in the breeze, was my gold scale, the one that had vanished 2 weeks before. I didn't wait for morning. I packed what I could carry, hiked to my extraction point, and called the pilot on the satellite phone. I told him it was a family emergency. I told him I'd pay triple the normal rate to get me out before noon. When he landed, I was already standing on the gravel bar with my bag at my feet, staring at the tree line. He asked me if I was okay. I couldn't answer. I just climbed into the helicopter, strapped in, and watched that creek disappear beneath the rotors. I sold the claim 3 months later at a 40% loss to a mining company out of Anchorage. I never told them why. I never told anyone until now. But I'll say this. Whatever was out there wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a former miner. It was something that had been in that valley long before the first gold prospector ever set foot in Alaska, and it did not want to share. I'm not going back to that claim. And if you ever find yourself alone on a creek in the Alaska range and your tools start disappearing, do me a favor. Don't set up a camera. Don't try to get answers. Just leave. After I got home, I didn't sleep for 3 days. I'd lie in my own bed in my own house with my wife beside me, and I'd see those pale white discs staring at me through the infrared. I'd hear the wind in the trees and my heart would start hammering because it sounded like something breathing just outside the window. I told my wife I'd had a bad season, that the ground wasn't as good as I'd hoped. She knew me better than that. She didn't push. But I caught her watching me sometimes, the way you watch someone who's come back from a war you didn't see. She knew something had happened out there, something I wasn't ready to talk about. I sold the claim to a mid-size exploration company out of Anchorage. They were happy to take it off my hands. The assay reports I'd compiled showed strong gold values, and the fact that I was walking away from proven ground at a discount made them think they were getting a steal. I signed the papers, took the check, and tried to put that valley out of my mind. For 6 months, I succeeded. Then in February of 2019, I got a phone call. The caller was a geologist named Simmons, the head of exploration for the company that had bought my claim. He said he'd gotten my number from the transfer paperwork and hoped I didn't mind him reaching out. His voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it. A hesitation, a carefulness. He asked if I had ever experienced anything unusual while I was working that creek. I asked him what he meant by unusual. He paused, then he said, "We've had some incidents, equipment disappearing. One of our geologists swears he saw someone standing at the edge of camp at night. We wrote it off as isolation jitters, but then we found something." I felt my stomach drop. I asked him what they found. He told me they'd unearthed a cache while trenching a new cut. Buried about 4 feet down, wrapped in oiled canvas, was a collection of mining equipment dating from the 1920s. Rock hammers, gold pans, a hand-cranked trommel, and a journal. The journal belonged to a prospector named Carl Dreyer who had filed a claim on that exact ground in 1923. The final entry was dated August 30th of that year. It described, in increasingly agitated handwriting, how someone had been stealing his tools at night and standing in the tree line watching his tent. The last line read, "It isn't a man. I don't know what it is, but it isn't a man. I'm leaving tomorrow." There were no entries after that, but the journal wasn't the only thing in the cache. Underneath it, they found bones. Human bones arranged in a careful spiral, the skull placed in the center facing upward. The coroner later identified them as belonging to a male, approximately 40 years old, dead for at least 90 years. Dental records matched Carl Dreyer. He hadn't left the valley. He'd been buried there by something that had taken the time to arrange his remains with deliberate, almost ceremonial precision. Simmons asked me again if I'd ever seen anything. I told him I'd seen enough. I told him I wouldn't go back to that valley for any amount of gold. He said he understood. 2 weeks later, the company pulled their crew. They cited logistical difficulties. They never filed another report on that claim. As far as I know, it's still sitting there unworked, the creek running over gold that no one will ever touch. I'm not the only one who's walked away from a creek in Alaska. Over the years, I've collected stories from miners all over the state, tales of claims that stay empty for decades, not because the gold ran out, but because of what came with it. Some ground is weighed down by history. Some ground is angry. And some ground, I've come to believe, was never meant to be worked by anyone at all. Jack's story has its own ending. After he sold the claim in October of 2019, a young miner named Travis flew in the following spring. Travis was 32, ambitious, and skeptical of the rumors he'd heard. He figured Jack was just an old-timer who'd let isolation play tricks on his mind. He set up his camp on the same gravel bar, pitched his tent in the same spot, and built his sluice within 20 feet of where Jack's had been. The first few nights were quiet. Then on the 5th morning, he walked down to the creek and found his sluice box cleaned. The tailings were squared. The riffles held gold he hadn't run. Travis was not a man prone to panic, but he wasn't stupid either. He remembered what Jack had told him about the trail camera. He set up his own camera that same day. He let it run for a week. When he reviewed the footage, he saw exactly what Jack had seen: the sluice changing between frames, the shimmer in the air, the slow, methodical work happening in the blind gaps. But Travis also caught something that Jack hadn't. One night, the camera recorded audio, a soft humming, the same tune over and over, something old and Scandinavian. Travis didn't recognize the melody, but he recorded it on his phone and later played it for a professor of music at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The professor identified it as a traditional Norwegian folk song called, for example, Sir Deg Utfor Gluggen, which translates to "I see you outside the window." It's a love song, a haunting ballad about a ghost watching over the living. Travis didn't find that comforting. He found it terrifying. But he also found something else, something that changed the way he thought about what was happening on that claim. Tucked into the frame of the sluice box, held in place by a small stone, was a piece of paper. The paper was old, yellowed, and on it, written in careful cursive, were the words, "Jakob, thank you. I will watch this ground until you return." Travis didn't know what to make of that. He called Jack, who by then had moved to a small town in Montana and was trying to forget everything about that claim. Jack listened in silence as Travis read the note aloud. Then Jack said very quietly, "My name is Jakob, my real name. I've never used it out there. I've never written it anywhere." Travis asked him what it meant. Jack said he didn't know, but he thought maybe the note wasn't addressed to him. Maybe it was addressed to the other Jakob, the one who had worked that ground in 1933, the one who never left. And maybe after 80 years, he had finally found someone to hand the claim over to. Travis worked that ground for 3 more seasons. He left offerings at the sluice every night: a little tobacco, a splash of whiskey, a note of his own. He told me once that he never felt alone on that claim. He felt accompanied, watched over, as if the land itself had accepted him. Earl found the same thing on his claim with Hamish McPherson. He finished his final season in 2022, and when he packed up his gear for the last time, he buried his favorite gold pan on the bank with a note that said, "Thank you for the partnership." He swears he heard a tap of metal on rock in reply. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, like a hand striking a pan in farewell. I think about these stories a lot now in the quieter months when the snow is falling and the creeks are frozen over. I think about Jakob Lindberg, who died with his hands in the sluice box, still chasing gold. I think about Hamish McPherson, who vanished in 1902, leaving behind a journal and a copper pan. I think about Carl Dreyer, whose bones were arranged in a spiral by something that had watched him from the trees. And I think about the thing that stood in my camp, the thing that held my shovel and hung my gold scale from the handle like a trophy. It didn't leave me gifts. It didn't hum folk songs. It just waited, studying me until I was gone. That valley is still out there, ungoverned, unworked. And whatever lives in it is still waiting too. The gold is real, every ounce of it. It brought people from all over the world to Alaska, drove them through ice and muskeg and swarms of mosquitoes thick enough to choke on. It made fortunes and broke men. It still does. But if you talk to enough old-timers, men who have spent 30 or 40 seasons out on the remote bush claims, you'll start to hear a common thread. The ground remembers. The gold remembers. And sometimes it doesn't want to be taken. Sometimes it wants to be remembered too. It wants the names kept alive, the rituals honored, the partnership acknowledged. And if you forget that, if you treat the ground like it's just rock and water and pay dirt, it might remind you, in ways you can't explain and can't forget. Here's what I've come to believe after 19 seasons in these mountains. The gold is not just metal, it's a record. Every flake that washed down from a quartz vein 1,000,000 years ago carries the memory of the land it passed through. The men who chased that gold, the Jakobs, the Hamishes, the Carls, they poured their lives into these creeks. Their sweat, their hope, their last breaths. You can't dig into that kind of history without stirring something up. The question isn't whether the ground remembers, it does. The question is what it chooses to do with that memory. Some claims are benevolent, they just want the work to continue. They leave you gifts, clean your sluice, hum Norwegian folk songs in the dark. They want a partner, not an owner. Other claims are different. They've been wounded. They've been treated like a transaction, like nothing more than rock and water and pay dirt. And when that happens, something wakes up that was never meant to be disturbed. I don't pretend to know what any of it means. I'm not a philosopher. I'm just a miner who's seen things that don't fit into any geological report. But I'll tell you what I've learned. You don't conquer the wilderness. You don't take from it. You enter into a relationship with it. And relationships, the real ones, are built on respect, on acknowledgement, on the understanding that you are not the first person to walk that ground, and you will not be the last, and the ground itself has a say in how things go. If you ever find yourself on a remote creek and the gold is good, and the nights are quiet, pay attention. If your sluice box is cleaner than you left it, or your tools start disappearing, or you hear a tap of metal on rock that doesn't have a source, don't panic. Don't set up cameras. Don't try to catch something in the act. Just take a moment. Acknowledge where you are. Say thank you. Leave an offering, even if it's just a splash of whiskey or a few flakes of gold returned to the water. The old-timers knew this. They didn't talk about it much, but they knew. The ground is alive with the history of everyone who tried to pull wealth from it, and some of them never left. If you enjoyed these stories from the Alaska goldfields, hit that subscribe button. I've got a lot more to share. Strange encounters, close calls, and the kind of history you don't find in textbooks. Drop a comment if you've ever experienced something in the backcountry you can't explain. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your sluice clean and your head on a swivel. And if you hear humming in the dark, just let it hum.